Hello! Today our presentation is on winterizing your roses, with a specific focus on USDA Zone 6B, as most of our members are in the Lehigh Valley and fall within this zone. My name is Nate Fisher, past president of the Lehigh Valley Rose Society. I am an ARS certified consulting rosarian, the 2021 ARS Rising Star Award recipient, and a botany and plant pathology student through Oregon State University's eCampus program. I formulated and registered with the PA Department of Agriculture an all-natural and organic rose fertilizer. I have also started hybridizing roses this year. I've gotten 288 rose hips, harvested with 2,464 rose seeds, currently cold stratifying. I have 102 roses in my own 0.055 acre property. I've also designed the Hopewell Park Rose Garden, which features 672 roses and 576 bulbs, annuals, perennials, with construction currently well underway. The question I get asked the most when planting roses: do you bury the bud union or not? The short answer is it depends. It's kind of a controversial subject in the rose world. For our area, it doesn't really get cold enough that it's absolutely necessary to do so, but at the same time you don't want to have the rose planted too high. I like this picture shown on this slide because it shows a rose with a long shank. The shank is the portion of the rose that is between the roots and the bud union. If you plant the rose where the shank is sticking substantially out of the ground, which sometimes happens, some people think that the ball that the roots emerge from is the bud union, even though it's not. You can create a couple different issues because of this. The roots wind up being planted fairly shallow. This is not good for multiple reasons. You want roots to grow deep downward into the ground for better nutrient and water absorption, especially during dry spells. If the roots are shallow, they'll dry out much faster and absorb less water, being more susceptible to those dry spells we can sometimes get, and then this requires more manual watering. But roots aren't just about providing water and nutrients, they're an important source of structure for the plant, holding it firmly in place. So the more shallow the rose's roots, the less stability the roots provide. If you have harsh winter winds, which I certainly did this past year, the canes can almost act as a sail, catching the wind, which causes the rose to rock back and forth. This loosens the soil around the roots of the rose. This can create air pockets, and if bad enough, it can even cause the rose to uproot. So the first step for winter prepping your roses happens well before winter. It happens when you're first planting your rose. You want to make sure that you plant it at the correct depth. So I personally do not bury the bud union on my roses, but I plant it flush with the ground. I then add a thick layer of mulch, and the mulch itself buries the union. So USDA zone, what is that? The USDA has a plant hardiness map. This is a handy guide that shows the average annual extreme minimum temperature in a specific area. So it divides the US into these various zones based off of this data that they collect. The zone boundaries can actually change over time based off of new data as it's collected from year to year. Farmers and gardeners find this information as a good indicator whether or not a plant will survive through the winter in their area, or on the opposite end of the extreme, if it's simply too hot in their area. Of course, we don't typically face that issue in Pennsylvania. But so Pennsylvania ranges from zones 5A to 7B. There's quite a bit of variability in our state depending on factors such as how close you are to, say, Lake Erie, or how close you are to the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, we have New Jersey as a bit of a buffer, but we're still not on the eastern coast of Pennsylvania, on the eastern edge of Pennsylvania. We're not terribly far from the coast. Or, of course, the elevation can play a big factor as well. So you have, the Allegheny Mountains, kind of out near Pittsburgh. It's a colder hardiness zone in that area. For our section, the Lehigh Valley, most of our area is in 6B. So when you're shopping for roses, to take that data to use, if you're purchasing roses in person, usually the retailer will not be selling roses that are not hardy for your specific area, but it's still always worth it just to check the tag in case. So if you're purchasing a rose in person, go ahead and look at that tag. It should say the zones that it's hardy to. If not, of course, you can look that up online. When you are purchasing roses online, you have more of a risk of ordering something that's not suited to your zone because they sell all across the United States. Some sell up into Canada, some are based in Canada and sell down here. So it's important to check and read the description carefully for each rose that you're interested in. As a pro tip, through ordering from over a dozen rose retailers online myself, I have seen the exact same rose listed with multiple different recommended zones. Just as an example, I've seen a rose where it was listed as winter hardy to zone 5 on one website, zone 6 on a different website, and zone 7 on another. So quite a drastic difference. So anytime I'm ordering roses online, I like to check multiple sites to see if there's some sort of consensus before I'll place an order. So what if you want to plant a rose in a pot? I hear this question all the time, and because I have such a small yard, it's something that I personally do fairly frequently. I have quite a few roses in pots. If you are planting roses in pots, you want to find one that measures 18 inches minimum at the narrowest point of the pot. That's very important to keep in mind because when you're purchasing a pot, typically they don't give you that measurement in the advertising materials or the descriptions or whatever. They'll have the opening of the pot and the height of the pot as the measurements that they'll tell you. So you want to, if you're purchasing in person, have a tape measure handy. If the opening of the pot is 18 inches, usually the bottom of the pot, since they taper inward, is, could be only 12 inches wide or even smaller. So you want to make sure that the smallest part is 18 inches. And you also want to make sure that the pot is at least 18 inches tall. And these really are the minimum sizes. If you can find a larger pot, that's better. When I'm looking at flower pots with the intention of using them for roses, I try to find ones that are also labeled as frost resistant, just as an extra precaution. These can typically be found at stores such as Home Depot and Lowe's. However, Michael Card Designs, he has a lot of pots in garden centers and nurseries, and he actually has a line of frost-resistant pots now. They're carried in a lot of the local garden centers. I have seen them at Irvine's, Dan Shantz, and I've seen them at Lehigh Valley Home and Garden. I'm certain I've seen them at those 3 places. I'm not 100% sure about Four Seasons, but you do get a 10% discount on pots there. So if this is something you're in the market for, I think it'd be worth it to give them a call before heading out to see if they do. It's also best when you're potting up roses that you pick the especially cold hardy roses to put in your pots. So you want to try and find roses that are rated a zone lower than the one you live in. So, for example, in our area, since we are 6B, you'd want to find a rose that's rated to at least zone 5. And one last tip, when you are placing this pot, try to place the pot against a raised bed or a fence or on the side of a shed or a garage or a playhouse or against your house, simply to provide some sort of additional protection, to get heat or as a windbreak. Um, I've found that, especially with my lavender plants, for example, I have all of those either against a fence, against the kids' playhouse, or against our house, and they do fantastic over winter for me. But the ones that I've had, just say in the middle of our yard in winter, I usually wind up needing to replace those, so I try and keep them against something at this point. And same concept with the roses, of course. So we've all enjoyed the lovely fall flush of blooms in our gardens. I honestly think that I enjoy it more than the first flush. The blooms seem to just have much more vibrant colors with the cooler temperatures we have outside now, and I am getting the bigger blooms. But when the blooms are all spent, it's time to clean up your garden. So there are a couple schools of thought on this procedure. Like many topics in the rose world, there is some controversy. Everyone has their own opinions, but the main idea seems to fall along the lines of how big is your garden. So for very large gardens, and in the ARS world, my 102 rose garden isn't really considered very large. A quick attack with a leaf blower to clear out all of the rose foliage that's fallen on the ground from the beds seems to be the preferred method. I've heard it said that there will always be some sort of element of fungal disease in my garden. There will always be spores. I'm not going to get overly concerned about spreading the spores around myself. I treat it every season. I can keep it under control. So once out from between the roses and into a clearing, the foliage gets bagged up and taken to a local compost site. The other thought, which I think most of our gardens would fall into this category of smaller rose gardens, trying to clear out the fallen foliage by hand without a leaf blower. So I have a wonderful tool by Bond, which is pictured here, a hand rake. I just got it at the start of this season, and I'm mad that I did not get this for myself sooner. It makes very quick work of raking up leaves and debris around the base of each rose. It's much less cumbersome than a regular leaf rake because it's a handheld size. So after I rake everything up, I put it into big blue plastic tubs that I purchased at Lowe's. These get easily loaded up into the back of our pickup truck and taken to the compost center. I don't have to worry about dealing with, plastic bags that rip from thorns and things like that. Just shove everything into these tubs and then dump them out when I get to the compost center. It works really nicely. What about pruning? So the fall is not the time that you want to do your heavy pruning. You want to save that until March or April, around the time you first start seeing new growth appear on your roses. But that being said, there is some pruning that you should do in the fall. This picture on the slide here shows an example of dead wood and necrotic tissue that's advancing down the stem. That is something that you would want to cut out at this point. So while I'm getting in between each rose, removing the foliage from the ground, I take it as an opportunity to look at each individual rose. Cut out any diseased or dead canes, anything that looks too thin, something that I think won't do well over the winter. Usually, something thinner than a pencil is a good rule of thumb. I check for cane borer, make sure that's cut out. If I have the time, I seal up the holes. I have a bonide pruning sealer that I like to use. I don't typically take this time to heavily prune anything, but I do try to cut back roses that have thrown some obnoxiously long canes in the fall, with the goal of making the canes on the rose more or less the same height, so there's less windrock. Just as an example, on my rose Earth Angel that I have out front, most of the rose at this point, this is the second season I've had it. It was planted in like May of 2021. Most of the rose is about 2.5 feet tall, but I had 2 canes that sprung up in September that each got to about 4 feet. Just these 2 individual canes, 4 feet tall. So I've cut those back so that they are the same height as the rest of the canes. So this is also a good time of year to assess the roses in your garden and see what you would like to keep and what just isn't doing it for you anymore. In my tiny garden, I have no grass. I have no more space for new roses, and less space is made. So a spot that a rose takes up here is a hot commodity. And I've had roses that have only lasted a season before being shovel pruned and replaced with something else. So ask yourself these questions when you're looking at your roses. Do you like it? Has it performed well for you this year? Has it been a magnet for black spot or powdery mildew? Has it been giving you too much of a headache dealing with these diseases, even with treatment? Did you get a nice flush of blooms, or did you only have 1 or 2? It was meh, and then it didn't give you anything else. Has it put on much growth, or is it just a small, little, sickly-looking plant? So all questions you want to ask yourself to see if you want to dig it up and replace it with something else. Mapping out your garden is something that's also a good thing to do this time of year. It can be something as formal as you want. It can be something like this computer-aided drawing with circles and numbers and a corresponding plant list where everything is meticulously measured and to scale. Or it can be hand-drawn or written in your gardening notebook. So it's something that gardeners tend to put on the back burner. Oh, I won't forget what I planted there. Then a couple of months or years later, what was that again? So with your neatly tidied up roses in beds, take a stroll through the garden, dig up those tags that you may still have wrapped around the base of the rose, and draw up a diagram of your garden, labeling each rose where it is, especially if you've planted them recently and they are fresh in your memory. It'll make quick work of it. Tags can go missing, they can become illegible, they can break, so having this backup is always invaluable. Right here is a very rough sketch that I did on the placement of the roses in my front yard. It's not to scale, it's not spaced accurately, but looking at this, I know which rose is which, even if their tags went missing or became illegible. So at the top of that slip it says house, that orients me into which bed is which, and then it's just the rows closest to the house to furthest from the house, and each bed there's basically 3 vertical rows, and I can follow those to read the name of each one. On the next slide is a slightly different way that I did it for a new raised bed that I built this year in the backyard. So along my fence between our house and our neighbor's house, I built a narrow raised bed here on top of a walkway. So it's like 5 feet walkway. Adding this raised bed knocked it down to like a 3-foot wide walkway, but still doable. So anyways, this is just a page from my gardening notebook. It's not even a drawing. But if you look at the top of the page, it says garage, the bottom of the page says house, so that gives me my orientation, and I know that if I'm standing here looking at the fence from left to right is black caviar, double delight, black Baccara, Ingrid Bergman, etc., all the way down the road, with Poseidon being the one that's closest to our garage. Mulching. This is another thing that you can do to winterize your roses, and I recommend doing it. I always put down a fresh layer of mulch in the spring. After the fall and the winter is done, plants are starting to awaken, but there isn't much color yet. That gorgeous pop of dark brown gives it a crisp and bright look that really helps to welcome the coming blooms and remind us of the coming season. So that's when I do my main mulching. I use a triple shredded hardwood mulch from Four Seasons in Briningsville. I really like the color of it. It's a nice dark brown without being dyed brown. It's also a great consistency. There aren't like huge chunks and little chunks and like slivers. And as it breaks down, it adds nicely to the health of the soil. So the one downside to this product, though, is that it does decompose kind of quickly. And so in the fall, I can sometimes be left with patchy areas where the mulch is much thinner than in other spots. So I take this time to make sure that there is a nice thick layer of mulch around the base of each rose to help keep it insulated. And this is my last recommendation for winterizing your roses. Get a soil test done. I can't stress enough the importance of this. Dig up some soil before the ground gets hard and before it gets frozen. And do this before you purchase any garden amendments or fertilizers for the next growing season. It will help to inform you of the correct purchases. My backyard is a great example of this. We had pretty much a blank slate. It was all grass with a chain link fence down each side, covered in English ivy, and an overgrown lilac by our garage that was growing into the garage foundation, and grass with a concrete sidewalk down the middle. Tess and I removed the English ivy, we removed the chain link fence, I built a wood fence, we ripped out all of the grass. Tess and I dug up the lilac and rented a stump grinder and everything. We got everything prepped except we hired a contractor to remove the concrete walkway. And the concrete dust from when the contractors jackhammered this sidewalk out of our backyard caused an increase in the pH of our soil. It was as high as 8.6 or 8.7 in areas, and you could pretty much trace out the path of our old sidewalk based off of the pH level of the soil in our yard at various points. So at that point, if I was going to be purchasing fertilizers to use on my roses and use them without knowing of the pH of the soil, it would have been a complete waste. The increased alkalinity negatively impacts a plant's ability to utilize phosphorus, iron, manganese, boron, copper, zinc, lots of micronutrients found in the soil. So by getting the pH corrected, the plants are then able to absorb the nutrients that I wanted to add through my fertilizer. So it's so important. You can send soil samples into the Penn State Extension. Their basic test, which measures the macronutrients, is $9, and then they have other useful add-on tests that you can pick. So like percentage of organic matter, micronutrient levels, soil composition, so knowing how much of it is clay, how much of it is sand, how much of it is silt. They're all useful tests and all fairly inexpensive. So if you'd like the link to that form with the instructions, please let me know and I'll be happy to email it to you. Now I'd like to open this time for questions. If anyone has questions,